Mo is a co-founder and CEO of Morta. I'm sure he's going to be telling us lots about that. So it's a startup focused on increasing productivity in construction by moving teams from disconnected spreadsheet-based processes to connected information hubs. And yeah, there's so many use cases. It's really fantastic. So this session is focusing on the role that connecting and managing information plays in ensuring successful project outcomes using processes like advanced work packaging and environmental, social and governance reporting and many others. Breaking the status quo, best practices and lessons learned based on our work supporting 50 plus leading asset owners, main contractors, multi-disc design firms and consultants. So he's got a breadth of experience in the industry. And one thing that I think is key is his contribution to our industry. So he's involved in Zero and building smart grids. Yeah, lots of stuff within the industry for the good of our industry. So I'm really pleased to introduce you and yeah, pass the.
Thanks so much.
There you go.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having me.
Looking forward to this.
Hi everyone. Thanks Emma for the introduction and for inviting me and us. Good to meet you all. My name is Mo. I'm one of the co-founders of Morta, as mentioned by Emma. I spent the first few years of.
Oh, sorry.
I'll just go to. Yeah, I'll be talking about data-driven project delivery and what that means. But just to give you a bit of an introduction about myself, I spent the first few years of my career working with the largest contractor in the Middle East. Spent it implementing systems on projects initially for project controls purposes. It was a mix of oil and gas projects and infrastructure projects. Then moved to the headquarters of the company and focused on best practices for data and information management for project delivery and for project controls. And really that's the lens that I come at all of this from. Towards the end of, especially since we're in an innovation track, towards the end of my work there, I was involved in the Innovation and R&D arm of the company and setting that up. And one of the things that I very quickly noticed is that the future of the industry is really exciting. Like we're talking about things that range from drones to 3D printing to digital twins, artificial intelligence, all super cool, all having impact in different ways within the industry. But the reality on the ground is today projects rely on hundreds of disconnected solutions for planning, tracking, and communicating critical day-to-day operations. Regardless of who I am, whether I'm a design manager, whether I'm a quality manager, I'm a BIM manager, information manager, commercial manager, regardless of my function, what happens is I'll go into some sort of system that exists for a specific purpose. That could be a planning system, that could be a document management system, that could be a material tracking system, that could be a quality management system. I'll pull data from these and I'll update an Excel-based tracker with this information. And then at best, I'll then upload that into a Power BI dashboard. And that results in all kinds of challenges within projects. I was actually watching the AWP track earlier, and one of the speakers mentioned that they had 750,000 spreadsheets in their project. And I went to him and I was like, really? I've seen a lot of spreadsheets, but 750,000 is quite the number. And ultimately that causes all kinds of issues. To just break it down a bit, really what it ultimately leads to is poorer information quality. And that costs the industry in many different ways. So when we're talking about information quality, we're talking about, we want accurate information that actually represents what we're talking about. We want it to be complete information. I need to have all of the information I need about my design or about my assets or about my material. And I need to make sure that it's there. I want it to be consistent. If I'm naming something, if I'm referring to an ID of a material or of a document or the name of a team or the name of a person, I want to make sure I'm calling and I'm relaying the same information consistently. Very good examples tend to be classification schemes, WBS codes, cost breakdown structures. Like they're all examples of things that we would want to name consistently. And while we have a lot of the requirements set out at the beginning of the projects, hopefully, it's still very difficult to actually enforce that consistency in the paradigm that exists today. And that ends up causing people can just manually enter something incorrectly and so on and so forth. And it ultimately makes it much more difficult to actually derive insight from the information that's needed. You need to make sure that the information is valid. One of the other big things is making sure that the information is unique, ideally. So what happens a lot is I'll enter a piece of information. I'll enter it in a specific way. Someone will then come, they'll take that same information, they'll duplicate it manually, and they'll then start managing processes of that. And that's effectively that's because a lot of the information isn't unique and it's not being reused. There's another statistic here that is well known in the industry. 94% of data, it was also mentioned actually earlier in one of the talks, but 95% of data in the industry currently isn't reused. So I'll write out this thing, but then I won't actually use it, and people will duplicate the same information over and over again. And that ends up causing challenges because if I make a change in one place, I then need to make it everywhere else. And then the same goes for integrity. We need to make sure that there is integrity and relationships between all of the information as needed. Now, but it's not just that the information quality is poor, that ultimately has business impact on our projects. So when we think about it, it really breaks down to these four things. The first is poor visibility. It's very difficult to understand where I am right now in a project, in a process, in the organization. I tend to, we tend to rely on periodic reports that are manually entered and that will come at a certain point in time, which then means we're waiting for the latest information in order to make the decisions that we need. And that ultimately affects our ability to be proactive in the way that we're intervening on projects. So the first is poor visibility. The second is time being lost. So there's a lot of time spent on wrangling data from different systems, collecting it from different systems, reminding people of the information that's needed, cleaning it up, and then creating the reports that are needed in order to make the decisions. A lot of risks are introduced. That varies regardless of the scale of the job. Ultimately, every job has many different participants, and there are hundreds of thousands and millions of pieces of data, and a person can make a mistake. And if they make a mistake, that can have a domino effect on the project, and that can cause many issues. And finally, and I think one of the most subtle, is opportunities for improvement are lost. So what I mean by that is, if you look at any of the jobs that we're on, we learned something in every single one of these jobs, but we learn them as individuals, ourselves. And then the other place that information is contained is often in these same spreadsheets. But that doesn't go back necessarily to the organization. And a lot of this data is actually lost, which means things I'm learning there aren't being taken with me for the future. Examples of that could range from what are the requirements that I actually should have needed in that project? What are deliverables that I would want? How did the supply chain member perform? Did they perform well? How did the consultant perform? And all of these things would then help me in informing my future decisions. Another one that I really like is actual costs. If you look at how contractors cost, it tends to be based on like the rates that they have based on historical jobs, but those don't often get updated with the actual costs that they incurred. So they take years until they update them. And then that means opportunities for improvement are ultimately being lost. the challenge of tracking is only getting more complicated. Complexity and scale of jobs is really, really high. That could range from just the scale, they're absolutely huge, but it could also be their complexity themselves is increasing. So things like data centers, for example, and healthcare facilities. There are a lot of interface points between these, and ultimately that means it's much more difficult to actually track. And it's much more critical to track the work that's ongoing there. The number of stakeholders involved is continuously increasing, and the number of changes has always been high, but I don't think that's going to decrease anytime soon. And if anything, it could be increasing. I think one of the most important too is the number of systems and data sources. So there are a lot of different places that you will need to get data from. That could be your own systems as an organization, but it could be the third-party systems of other parties like the third parties that you're working with. And increasingly with things like IoT and with a lot of the emerging technologies, we're only going to have more and more data sources that we're going to need to stay on top of. Now, that's the challenge effectively on a high level. Like that's where the industry is at today. That's what we're facing. There are various ways that people are tackling and organizations are tackling this challenge. The first is dedicated solutions. So effectively, most of the software that you're used to or that you would have experienced within the industry is what I describe as a dedicated solution. So it's a solution that's very good at storing documents, for example. Other examples could be field solutions, or they could be accounting systems that are a dedicated solution for like accounting purposes. Those solutions tend to be really good in many ways because they have optimized for these specific problems that they're looking to solve. But they tend to not be very easy to customize. That tends to be a big challenge when it comes to scaling their use across companies. And then they tend to not connect to each other very, very well. So they're designed well for that specific persona, but they don't interface with everything else in necessarily the way that they should. The second category that we have that's starting to emerge is described as no-code solutions. So no-code solutions tend to be solutions that are highly flexible. They enable you to build, in many ways, a solution that you want, but they have the properties of a database and they tend to be more user-friendly and like, are web-based and more accessible. Most of the no-code solutions that you'll generally come across are horizontal. They don't focus on any specific sector. They're used across sectors. You may have seen ads because they come up Monday.com. I'm sure you've seen a YouTube ad for Monday.com at some point. Things like Notion, Asana, Airtable, Smartsheets. They're all examples of no-code solutions in that category. But ultimately, they have the same flexibility of spreadsheets, utility of a database. The last option is building it yourself. I went and asked the speaker with the it says 750,000 spreadsheets, what did you do? And they were like, we're building a whole suite of solutions ourselves. And we're seeing that quite a bit. We're seeing, especially when it comes to the very top players and the largest players, they can in some ways afford sometimes to go, I'm going to go and build it myself. But what we're also seeing is very quickly they come to the realization that that won't scale. They'll have built it for that specific job in a specific way. When it comes to going to a different job, that may not work. It's difficult to keep on top of all of the updates that are needed, maintaining it, making sure that all of the integrations are needed are in place, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to actually scaling it, it becomes a massive, massive effort. And there is a lot of reinventing the wheel effectively in what's being made. And that then ultimately isn't as agile as it's as needed and as the learnings effectively what's it called? I also often see with this build it yourself scenario, some companies will spec it out and then you'll talk to them 2 years later and they'll still be going, yeah, we're still building it. But for the 2 years effectively, while that's been happening, they haven't collected any information around the processes and what should be happening. Now, where we come in is we see ourselves as a mix of all of these solutions. So we provide hubs that connect information, point solutions, and construction teams together. So in many ways, we see ourselves as a no-code solution, but we're the only ones that fundamentally focus on the built environment and the construction sector. We're usually focused on office teams. And what you can see is effectively we end up combining a lot of what would be in Word and what would be in Excel, bring it to a collaborative hub that's web-based and that all of the teams can then access and see the information that's relevant to them from. But we also integrate with other solutions like Procore or Viewpoint or Aconex and the likes thereof. And ultimately what that does is helps bring the information that you need together into a single hub. Now to break that down slightly into a few key components. First, the platform comes with the familiarity and flexibility of spreadsheets with the power of a database. So in many ways, that's where what most no-code solutions will actually offer. So if you think of a spreadsheet, what it gives you is the ability to build your own tracker in the way that you want. Suddenly you want to track something around carbon, you can open it up and build a tracker. You want to track something around design, you can open it up and build a tracker. You can add the columns that you want, but then someone can go and delete a column, change the name of a column, remove the column, so on and so forth. In this case, you can add the columns that you want, but then the end users can't make changes to what you've actually set up. The second key thing is each of these columns actually have specific data types. So when I say status here, this is a drop-down list it's a select list that's coming out of a central data source. And if I update my list of statuses, it updates across all of my trackers, which means that everyone is then working off consistent information. The same goes for things like date fields, for example. That's actually a date field, which then means that the data quality is more appropriate and it's the specific date format and that ISO that's actually required for that project. So everyone is actually entering dates consistently and that makes analysis much easier and so on and so forth. And that goes on. But the idea fundamentally is there's far more control over the data that's being fed into these tables, even though it looks like a spreadsheet, a lot of the dealings with it are like a spreadsheet. The second key aspect is we make it very easy for companies to reuse data. So ultimately, right now, it almost takes a whiz kid to extract, it needs technical skills to extract data out of something like Viewpoint and bring it into a system. Or it takes time to extract it via Excel. What we're doing is we want to make it very easy for the average professional who isn't very technical to start syncing data and reusing it as much as possible. So we always have the option to sync data. We've started with the document management systems and the BIM systems mainly. And in one click, effectively, you can click sync on something like Viewpoint for projects, and then you can pick the project you want from there, and you can get all of the metadata around the documents that have been uploaded there. And then that updates on its own and on a periodic basis. Now, effectively, where we're getting to now is we have higher quality information, have connected information, or bringing in information from different hubs. The next step is we start making this information more accessible. So obviously we're hearing a lot about AI. One of the things that we've recently done is we've said, okay, what happens a lot on many of these projects is people ask questions for things that there are answers for in the documentation, in the EIR, in the procedural documents that have been written, for example, or the execution plans that have been written. So we've recently enabled the Morta AI search type feature, where you can actually ask a question. So you could ask questions like, what is the file naming convention of this project? And then based on the answers based on the information within the document, it would provide the answers that are needed. So that starts making the information more accessible. We're also going into things like reporting. So we usually integrate with things like Power BI, but we're starting to invest in some charting capabilities because we're seeing Power BI has limitations when it comes to third parties or ad hoc reporting, for example. So that's really where we come in. Now, the last piece effectively is because we focus completely on the sector, we come with a lot of the templates that are needed to help an organization get started. So we know, for example, many people need BIM execution plans, many will need exchange information requirements, master delivery plans and trackers. We have examples for these. That serves a few purposes. The first is we acknowledge that there is a shift in behavior from Excel to this world. And we want to make sure that companies and teams are maximizing the benefit out of these types of systems. And a lot of what our templates are there for are exactly that. We are already built relationships between the different data sets that are involved, which then means you're actually making best use of the system and you're using it based on best practices. The other thing is we usually start these templates ourselves as a company. So someone says Building Safety Act has come up where we want this tracker, we'll build something for that specific company. But then what happens is our community starts using it. And as they're using it, they comment and they go, actually, for design deliverables tracking, can we link it to our work packages list, for example? And then that starts informing how these develop. So ultimately, when someone is deploying our templates, it's not just our knowledge, but it's the collective knowledge in many ways of the community and the feedback that we're getting there. Now, ultimately, the aspiration and where companies generally go with Morta is the direction of travel is to connect and track information across the project delivery lifecycle. You can see information is highlighted in green in this bubble. So I'm just going to break this diagram down a bit quickly to you. First, what we have here in the middle is effectively everything we see as controlling a project. They're the types of things that need to be planned, that need to be tracked in order to control a project. So at the top, I have what we describe as things that govern it. So requirements and quality, cost, carbon, and time. Increasingly, those are the 4 key things that we need to govern for. Then there is the scope of work. It could be design, construction, or operation if I'm an owner. Then there is the resources. There are the resources required to deliver the mix of work. So if I'm in design phase, I need a mix of supply chain members and workforce members. If I'm in construction phase, I probably need supply chain, workforce, material, and assets. And then there are what we describe as interface areas: information management, risk management, and change management. If you think about it, each of these boxes effectively has a team and one or multiple trackers for this information. And they tend to be all siloed from each other. What's happening here is we tend to plan and track things. But on the left, on this side here, you can also see there are icons for a few systems. Because the way we see it is there is something like P6 that someone has to interact with, which will have the dates, P6 or ALSTA projects. There will be the document management systems. There will be the ERPs. There will be IoT devices, field devices. These are all of the types of things that you need to pull data from and reuse data from in different contexts. And in many ways, I think where digital is at is it's very good at capturing the actuals, what has actually happened. And all of these systems are in many ways examples of that, except for P6. But what the gap that's been left is what are we expecting to happen and has it happened or has it not? And that's really where Excel usually plays a massive role, and that's where we come in. In the short term, we usually start by helping in one of these boxes. So if you think about it, a design manager could have a problem like wanting to understand whether a design is compliant. An information manager wants to understand if the information is complete and fit for purpose. A commercial manager wants to understand if a project is within budget. A quality manager wants to understand whether requirements are being followed. And a sustainability manager may want to understand planned and actual carbon footprint, or whether all of the evidence they need has been received. We start by supporting and streamlining and the answering of one of these questions in many ways. And usually it ends up being something related to information management. But then over time, companies start building other examples and other trackers and moving them on top of the platform. So things like cost are starting to happen a lot now. Things like handover of asset data is starting to happen now, and so on and so forth. Now, the most popular use case by far is streamlining information planning and automating its tracking. So what happens today is we'll have the reference data and the requirements and the responsibilities. We'll then have usually an Excel-based tracker that's now been replaced by a Morta tracker, where rather than having 50 different Excel files per supply chain member, all supply chain members can go in and can see the data that's relevant to them. When they're filling this in, this already has drop-down lists from things like the requirements data, the reference data, which means they're all filling in information consistently. And then the part that they usually hate the most as supply chain members and that you hate the most is going into external solutions and checking did they actually deliver on the work or did they not deliver on the work that they've planned for in that tracker. And what we do is we integrate via API with these solutions, as I talked about earlier in the one-click integrations, and we automatically look up what has been received against what has been planned. So at any given point in time, an organization can have an understanding of where it's at by automatically tracking planned versus actual, has near real-time visibility and leading indicators and a reduction of risk. I think some of the things have gone wrong on the transition to Google Slides.
Apologies.
That's okay. One of the things I want to highlight is a quote that we have from James Franklin from Kier. So Kier were the first company that adopted us for information delivery planning and tracking. And Wates are also using it for information delivery, planning, and tracking. But
risk averse.
But one of the things that he highlighted, and I realize this is coming from a main contractor, but I think it applies across the board. The reason they like the platform is they always wanted to create a standardized approach internally as a company. The problem is they don't know what mix of solutions they're going to have to interact with. So if they work with the Ministry of Justice, it may need certain things. If they work with Shell, may need different things. And if I just, because we heard a talk earlier from Shell as a client, but depending on the client or the Department for Education, there are different requirements and different systems they have to integrate with. And what they liked about Morta is that they could standardize their process, but they then know that they could hook into and out of the systems that they need when they need to, depending on the setup of that project. And that helps them standardize their processes internally. Now, ultimately, there is a range of benefits. It comes down, really, I would say one of the biggest ones is risk and compliance, just generally speaking, and mitigating risk from all of the manual work that has to take place. Saving a day a week, at least, from every professional who would have had to do this in terms of the coordination. Consistency and standardization, which is critical for analysis and for understanding where things are at and for informing decisions, and then getting visibility and insight. We're also seeing things like Industry 4.0 and the pressure or people wanting to adopt AI. You need to have high quality data effectively in place in order for these things to happen, as we heard from previous speakers. And we're seeing that that's increasingly a driver for the move out of spreadsheets. When it comes to taking time out, as I mentioned, it really comes down to removing things like checking data quality, collecting and extracting data, emails and notifications, and producing reports. Glenn, what they really liked is it just supports in automatically tracking planned versus actual. They want to know that they're getting what they planned for. And I think that's what we all need in projects. And this basically process just puts it on autopilot. I think one of the things that makes us unique is we're working across the supply chain. We're working with asset owners, we're working with multidisciplinary design firms, we're working with tier ones, and we're working with specialists. I think what that gives us is first, everyone here is effectively pulling in the same direction. And what's really nice is we're starting to see different players collaborate with each other and discuss what this shift to this post-spreadsheet world will look like for all of them. But I think the other thing that it gives us that's really important is when we provide a template or a sample process for an owner, we have an understanding of how a contractor is going to interface with that process, and we have an understanding of how the subcontractor will interface with that process later. And we're not just thinking about optimizing for one persona, we have an idea of how all of these different pieces of the puzzle are going to interact with each other. I think that's very, very important in this move towards connecting data long term. Oh, there are few case studies. Sphere was, if you've seen the Sphere that got built in Vegas, it's a $2.3 billion Sphere. They're our first client. What they really wanted to achieve was surety of outcome for their delivery. We integrated with over 50 data sources, and we were then able to automate many of their manual processes, and we're working towards a standardized data model across their portfolio to give them visibility on how their different projects are doing. The Ministry of Justice is using us across their estate. What they really wanted to do is create a connected approach to managing the organization assets and different programs. And one of the things they were after too was to reduce the number of duplicate requirements that they had all over the place, and they've been able to do that and automatically track against 30 plus viewpoint instances across their different programs to understand their performance. Kier, as I mentioned, has been streamlining delivery planning and automating tracking. And Mott MacDonald has been using it on infrastructure jobs. So that was our first infrastructure job. But even though there are a lot of similarities, there were some subtle differences. But the platform can easily be used across different sectors because it's very flexible. One of the things that I really liked here is they were able to get really detailed audit trails to understand who had done what and how did their plans evolve over time. And then lastly, with ALIC in the Middle East, I think they themselves in the work we've been doing with them are a case study on innovation and in the way that it's been approached. But they started by wanting their information management resources to be built on Morta. And then what happened was people started going, I have this Excel tracker and I have that Excel tracker, and can I move that Excel tracker into something like Morta? And it's almost become an innovation exercise in and of itself. And they almost have these many challenges of who's going to build what. And they've now gone out of just using Morta for information management, but they're using it for things as like, in my eyes, random as marketing trackers, but they're also using them for things like workforce and training trackers and change trackers and derogation trackers and so on and so forth. And with that, thank you very much for listening, and I hope you found that useful.